Let's talk about photography and image editing because photography is an art. My name's Barry Beckham. This is Port Douglas, northern Queensland, Australia. A beautiful evening but with high contrast lighting. The sun hasn't set, it's still just behind that shed. So the photographer has had to deal with high contrast here. If we expose to get a good sky, then the shadows are going to be far too heavy. If they expose for the shadows, then the sky loses all of its impact. So sometimes we may make a compromise exposure, an exposure that sits between the sky and the shadows. But of course we'll have to lighten the shadows a little bit, and we're going to have to darken the highlights a bit too. Now the author here has chosen automatic exposure bracketing. What they've done is to set up 3 shots with 1 stop exposure difference between each of them. So if we've set up auto exposure bracketing here with 1 stop between each, if we look at the settings below these thumbnails, with the image on the left hand side we can see plus 0.3. So we've got about 1/3 of a stop more exposure than the camera wished to give. In normal circumstances perhaps we would expect to see that showing no increase at all. The next one may show 1 stop less exposure than the camera wished to give, and the one on the right may show 1 stop more than the camera wished to give. So why have we got 0.3 with the image on the left, 0.7 with the center image, and 1.3 with the right image? What the author's done here is to just use the exposure compensation dial on the back of the camera, or however your camera allows you to do this, and they've scrolled all 3 of those bracketed exposures a little bit to the right. So what we're doing here is leaning more on squeezing more light into the sensor rather than less. So given that we've got 3 different exposures here, why don't we combine all 3 and make a high dynamic range image? So holding the control key, I'm going to select all 3 of these images and open them up into Adobe Camera Raw. Once I've got them open, I need to select all 3 again, then right click and I'm going to choose to merge to HDR. Now you can see with the panel that's appeared on screen we have some options here. Yes, I'm going to align the images because I'm not entirely sure if the author here used a tripod. I suspect they did, but just in case they didn't, I want to align any slight movement between 3 handheld shots. I'm also going to allow the auto settings to give me a starting point. Because we're going to be working on a raw file, it really doesn't matter whether we tick this box or not. There's no downside, so we may as well tick it, see where it takes us, and we can take over from there. And if we're going to align images and we're going to de-ghost any areas caused by that alignment, then I want that set to high. So what I'm going to do is click merge. Now we're going to be asked to save a file name, but it gives us a file name which we can change if we like, but I'm happy with that. And what it's going to do is create a new thumbnail on the left hand side, which is a combination of those 3. I'm going to click down here just to remove those because this HDR image is the one we're now interested in. If you look up at the top right, you can see that the histogram is looking quite healthy, certainly a good place to start. And if I were to go and open the basic tab, we will see some of the changes already made by that automatic adjustment made during the HDR process. But of course none of this is cast in stone. We can change any of it or all of it if we wish. I think we need to start with a little bit of cropping. Now if we go up to select the crop, first thing we notice is that the composition here is pretty good. The horizon, or where the water meets the land on the far side, is nicely on that bottom rule of thirds line. We've got the boat coming into the picture, and it would be a much worse picture if the boat was heading out. So it's heading right in towards the point where the vertical and the horizontal lines cross. And we have a similar sort of thing with the shed on the left hand side. And of course we've got a fishing boat here which appears to be returning to harbour or its dock, and we also appear to have some industrial complex, so we're telling a story too. Now I think the horizon is fairly straight, but maybe I just need a tiny little tweak, just a little bit. Hardly anything at all, but I think I could crop up from the base. I don't think we need all of that dark area of mud. But to bring that rule of thirds line back into position, I don't think we need quite as much sky at the top either. So if we come back down there, we bring our composition back into a good place. I think I'll have a little bit more at the bottom. And we also have the horizon straightened. I'll have a little bit in on the right hand side. The left hand side, I think I'll just come into that upright so we've got no light areas down the edge here. So I think that is a pretty good crop. It doesn't affect the composition, but I think it gives us a bit more of a panoramic shape too. So I'm going to hit the Enter key to commit that and Control 0 to fit it on screen. But of course, as you probably know, when I say we hit the Enter key to commit the crop, we don't, because if we reselect the crop from the top right of the toolbox, we can undo or adjust any of those changes we've just made. That's the beauty of working with a raw file in Adobe Camera Raw. Now, I wonder how many people viewing this image can instantly see that it has a slight blue cast. The reason I say that is because belonging to a camera club for many years, I see lots of seascapes where the white water that's rolling over from the waves is vivid blue. And it's caused because someone has shot an image in the golden hour where there's a tendency towards blue. They haven't corrected the colour balance, but then they've cranked up the saturation. And of course the result of that is a horrible blue water where it should be white. Let me try to demonstrate what I mean by selecting the eyedropper tool from the top right of the basic tab. If we go to either the white areas on the boat, or maybe better still the white areas or the boarding on the side of that big shed, if I click it just once, look at the difference that it makes. The reason it does that is because if we have a colour shift towards blue and we correct that, it's also going to affect all colours of the spectrum, in our case the warm tone colours of the sunset. To be able to see that blue cast that I could see as soon as the image opened up, if I hit Ctrl Z to undo that colour balance change, now I think most people viewing this will be able to see that the side of the building does have a blue cast. So before we move on, I need to click once again, and of course once we do this, we don't have to stay with the colour balance that's presented to us. If we go over to the right hand side, we have two sliders. I tend to think of the tint as being a corrective slider, but maybe the temperature as being a creative one. So if I double click this, it's going to take us back to where we was with the blue tone a few moments ago. So the automatic setting brought it up to about that position, but I'd like to just back off a little bit. So I get a nice bit of colour there, but perhaps not quite so over the top. Now, working with a HDR image allows us to bridge the gap between highlights and shadows. Now, we can't claim here that the gap was super wide to start with. It wasn't. But if it allows us to get a slightly better image without having to push those sliders too far, then I tend to think of HDR as another trick up my sleeve for when I need or want it. Now, I think most of the automatic settings that were put in place with the HDR conversion are working reasonably well. Looking down them, I don't want to change the exposure. The highlights, they've been reduced quite a lot, which you would expect. The shadows have been raised, although I'd like to do something with that shed. The whites are up a little bit and the blacks are down a little bit. The only thing we could really tweak here is a bit of clarity if we need it. So if we wanted to step the clarity up, we can do so. To be honest, I'm not sure the picture needs it that much. I think it's got quite a lot going for it as it is. And I think if we push up the clarity, maybe a little bit, but we can't go too far with this. So the next thing I'd like to deal with is the sky. I'd like to give the sky as much impact as I can. I think we can be a bit heavy, particularly towards the top of the sky, given that we've got such a solid base to the image. So if we go to the top right, I'm going to select my gradient filter. I'm going to click and drag from about that point, if you can see the cross right in the middle of the screen, all the way down to about there. Remember, we can always adjust this after we've made our changes. Sometimes when we apply these filters, they'll have a previous set of settings from whatever we used it before. I tend to get into the habit of right-clicking and resetting them. Then I touch the V key to hide the selection so that when I make the changes, I've got a nice clear screen and image to make my decisions. So let's move over first to the exposure. We'll take a look at bringing that down. Maybe we could look at a little bit of temperature. Maybe I'll drop it towards the blue a little bit, just a touch. Remember, when we're changing these sliders so small, these are personal choices. There's no real rights or wrongs here. But the exposure, I would suggest, is a right or wrong. We definitely needed less exposure in the sky. I'm going to go down to the blacks and I'm going to step them down a little bit, and there you can see it's coming up a wee bit stronger. And maybe even I'll investigate a bit of clarity there, just to put a bit of impact into the sky, and maybe just a touch of saturation, but not too much. I don't like sunsets where the yellow we see as the sun is setting looks unnatural. So here I think it looks reasonably good. So for the moment, we need to stop and think about what we're going to do next. Now, if I just touch that V key, it'll bring back that bounding box for the graduated filter. Now, we're going to get some overspill onto the shed there. We can do a couple of things here. I'm going to suggest that perhaps what we ought to do is to lighten the shed in its entirety. But we do have an opportunity whenever we draw a gradient filter down over the image. It's going to have some impact over the middle. Sometimes we want to alleviate that. We've got a dark roof here. I don't think it's very crucial on this occasion, but it could be. In that case, with the graduated filter selected, you can go to the top right of the screen and choose your eraser. Then you can erase the effect of the graduated filter just in the areas you think is necessary. But I'd like to deal with the shed and maybe the boat as well and raise the tones there, but I think I'm going to use my adjustment brush for that. So let's go to the top right of the screen and select the brush. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to investigate an auto mask. I'm going to tick the box here and the mask options, because what I'm going to do is mask along the edge and around this building. If you look over on the right hand side, you can see the feather for this brush is quite low at 33. The flow is very low, so I think I need to return and push that up quite high. In fact, I will bring the feather off a little bit, I think. And what I'll do is just touch that control key and drag the image up. What I'm going to use is the auto mask. So I'm going to mask along the edge there and down, and now down this edge and along the bottom. Now I'm holding the control key there. That's a nice little shortcut that's worth knowing about. First of all though, touching the spacebar so I can move my image to the right. There's a technique which I've demonstrated a number of times in Photoshop, and it never used to be available in Camera Raw, but it is now. If you click with a brush to create a mask, and you hold the shift and you click a little further away, you'll paint between two straight lines, and you'll be amazed that you can actually go around quite tight corners and some difficult subjects sometimes. But here, it just speeds up the process, because if I hold the shift key and click, and click, and click, now all I've got to do is to shade in the middle, and as I begin to do that, of course, I can bring up the size of the brush, so I can do the rest of this pretty quickly and easily. Now once I've got my masking done, I'll need to turn it off so I can actually see the effect of what I'm about to do. So let me hit Control 0 and I'll go back over to the right hand side. Just for the moment, I'm going to untick the mask options. Now you can see everything's gone dark. The reason it's done that is because we've already got some settings down here. So I'm going to go back to my pin that controls this, hover over it, right click, reset the local correction settings. Exactly the same thing as I did a few moments ago with that graduated filter. So now what are we going to do here? I'd like to raise the tones, but the tones have got to be in balance with the rest of the image. If we raise them too much, it'll look unnatural. Now we're talking about shadow areas here, so let's put up the shadow detail just a little bit. Oh, that jumped up pretty much as I want it straight away, to be honest. That was pretty good. I was going to say we could probably add a bit of exposure too, but that's what I meant when I said we can go too far. Let's knock off those shadows by double clicking, and we'll double click the exposure. So what's the best thing to do here? Exposure or shadows? To be honest, there doesn't seem to be a great deal to choose between the two. So choose whichever one is going to do the job that you want, and I think that's about as light as I want to go with that shed. But I would like to do something with the boat here. So maybe while we've got those settings in place, if I touch the control key, I can bring the size of the boat up. Now we know the settings here are not going to be too bad, but what I would like to do is to really create a new brush. So I'm going to hit the little plus up at the top right and start a new brush. And that rather was a little bit too heavy. So I'm going to drop the flow right the way down. I'm usually much more comfortable using this around 3, 4, 5. But there you can see I can now gradually just raise the tones here where I feel they need to be raised. We don't need to raise a lot of detail from the boat, but just not have it maybe quite as dark as it was, just to make it look a bit more of a feature of the picture, because after all, it is telling the story which I was mentioning earlier on. So a little bit of care here, but I think that's all we need. I'll hit Control 0 and maybe I'll take just a little time out to decide what, if anything, I'd like to do next. It's never a bad thing, if you have the patience to do this, is to just hit the Done button down at the bottom right and store the work you've done on an image and come back. Sometimes it only needs 10, 15, 20 minutes later, and then review what you've done. One thing I'll draw your attention to, we do have a little light area behind the fishing boat and on the right hand end of that shed. I didn't miss them. It's obviously something to do with the glow of the atmosphere in the hills behind and maybe the sun behind the shed. But I think if we want to do something about that, it'll be much easier to do in Photoshop. So I'm going to save that and take a look later on if I still feel it's a problem. I'm going to take a look at using another graduated filter to add a little extra blue into the top of the sky. A couple of reasons for that. I think the blue we're currently seeing is a little bit dull. I'd like to get a little bit more of a lift there. But also blue is complementary to yellow, so it wouldn't be a bad thing to do from that point of view. And there's no risk to this because we can always delete any graduated filter. So if I select the filter and click down from the top, that's the sort of area I want to work on. Once again, I'll touch the V key to hide these, but I'm going to go over to the right hand side and scroll all the way down, and I'm going to click the little color panel on the right here. It's labeled color, but at the moment it's white. What I'm going to do is to push up the saturation and move the color along until I get a believable blue, something around there. That's obviously a little bit too saturated, so now I can bring down the saturation just to give a little more blue into that sky. Not a great deal, but just a little bit. Remember, any of the changes that we make to our images, they're generally a series of small steps, each one insignificant on their own. It's when we add them all up that we get a big change. Now at this stage I'd like to open up this image into Photoshop. You'll notice it says Open Object, and that's because I've got the Smart Object status turned on. Now I don't think I need my Smart Object status here, so I'm going to go to my thumbnail, just to the right of it, right click and choose to rasterize that layer. Because what I'd like to do here is first of all deal with that little bit of lightness around the boat and the shed, and maybe one or two other small tweaks in Photoshop. And then I'd like to look at a couple of creative opportunities. I'm going to hit Ctrl-0 to fit the image on screen and go over to the toolbox on the left hand side because I'm going to select my burn tool. From the options at the top of the screen, I want to select midtones, and I'm going to keep the exposure extremely small. I'm going to start with 1%. What I'm going to do here is move my brush over to the boat and just brush over that gently. And you can just see that lightness behind the boat is just beginning to be subdued. Now the reason I've got such a low exposure setting is because these brushes are much easier to control if we have to go over the area a number of times to build up the tones. Here, for example, I can just go up and down a couple of times or left and right a couple of times, and I think we can achieve the same thing. We may need to zoom in a little bit. No problem with that, and we can make the brush slightly smaller, but the same process. Be very, very gentle and make sure that you don't overdo these things. I think I'd be happy to leave it there. But what I may do is a little bit more work on the highlights in the mud at the bottom. We've got a number of them right along the bottom edge, and I never like anything that's light along the edges. There's a couple on the bottom right upright as well. So what I may do here is to increase that exposure. I'm going to increase the exposure to about 10% by hitting the number 1 key. With the brush made bigger, I'm just going to try to subdue those mid-tone highlights. Maybe they're a bit lighter than I thought, so I'm going to go back up to my range and switch to highlights. I just want to subdue them a little more, not a great deal, but enough. Then I would select my healing brush from the toolbox on the left. I would zoom in And areas like this where I've got lightness right at the bottom, I may do a little bit of work on those sorts of things, just moving across. Attention to detail is what I always describe this as. Small things which most people may not even see, but every little step soon adds up. And finally, as you can see by the selection I have on screen, I've made a freehand selection. I've inversed that selection just to select the outer edge, and I've added a degree of feather to that selection line to 450 pixels. Once again, I'm going to hide that selection with Control H this time. Then I'm going to bring up my levels. The levels we'll find in the image menu, but Control L is the shortcut for that. I'll put that in the center because all I want to do here is darken down the edges just a little bit. A little vignette. There we can see the before and after. It does make a nice difference to the image. Click OK. Control D to remove that selection. And then I would be saving this image as a completed picture. Now I brought you back into Adobe Camera Raw here to the image just before we opened it into Photoshop. I was going to go through one or two derivatives, but I can see my video is getting rather lengthy here, so I want to bring it to a close. What I'd like to do is to zoom in on one section of the image and just take a look at the noise. I think that's a little bit heavy, so I'll come back down to about 270, and we can see a little bit of noise there, but we have to take into account the size of the image. But I'd like to go to my detail tab here, bring up the noise to something around 25. What have we got there? 29. In actual fact, that doesn't look too bad. Let's double click to reset. Maybe I can squeeze a bit more. Maybe something like 30. So one of the things I neglected to do as I was going through the video, because I intended, as I said, to look at one or two derivatives, but I think we've more or less run out of time. So I just wanted to touch on that noise reduction just to finish the image. Of course, I'd need to open this up into Photoshop, deal with that little bit of ghosting around the boat and the shed, but maybe we can end on just a quick soft focus effect. So once we have the image opened up into Photoshop and we've saved our original, it's then we can turn our attention to making some derivatives and see if we can improve matters, or maybe just try something new. What I'm going to do here is copy my image with Control J, and with the top layer on the right hand side in the layers palette, I'm going to select my filters. Now this soft focus effect is pretty quick and easy, and it's also very versatile. If we go to the filters menu and down to blur and Gaussian blur, I'm going to put an amount of blur into the image around about 10 pixels. It's going to vary depending on the resolution of your image. This is a 20 megapixel image, so 10 pixels looks about right to me. Once I've clicked OK to that, I've now got two layers, one sharp and one soft. Now I can investigate blending the soft layer with the sharp one using the opacity, and generally speaking, somewhere around 50% usually gives quite a nice look. But the beauty of this is if we get a softness in a part of the image which we'd rather not have it, or we want to reduce it, select the layer, add a layer mask, and you can paint onto the mask to let the sharp image below show through the soft one. I'll see you next time.